I didn't plan to touch him, I just needed someone dangerous enough to make my ex stop following me. The rain hit the pavement in sharp, relentless bursts, soaking through my heels, my dress, my skin, until everything felt heavy and cold. It was like I was carrying the entire night on my shoulders, and still I kept walking, faster than I should have in 3-inch heels. I kept glancing back every few seconds because I could feel him there, even before I saw him. Evan Brooks. 5 years of my life that refused to stay in the past. His silhouette cut through the crowd behind me like he owned the street, like he owned me. My chest tightened the way it always did when I realized I couldn't just disappear, not tonight, not anywhere, not from him. My phone was dead. My rideshare app had frozen 10 minutes ago. Every passing car blurred into streaks of light that never slowed down, never stopped, because no one notices a woman running unless she falls. And I wasn't going to fall. Not in front of him. Not again. I turned the corner too fast and nearly slipped, catching myself against a cold brick wall. My breath came in shallow bursts as I pressed my palm against my ribs, counting 1, 2, 3, like if I slowed down my heartbeat, he wouldn't find me. But footsteps echoed closer. Steady. Patient. Like he knew I'd run out of places to go. And that's when I saw him. Standing under the awning of a hotel I couldn't afford to walk into, let alone stay in. Tall. Still. Dressed in a black suit that looked untouched by the storm, like the rain had decided not to touch him. A black SUV idled at the curb beside him, headlights low, engine quiet but powerful in a way you could feel in your chest. There was something about him. Something in the way he stood, like he wasn't waiting for anyone, like the entire city moved around him instead of the other way around. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. Because hesitation was what got me caught before. I pushed off the wall and walked straight toward him. Each step sounded louder than it should have in my ears. My pulse roared. My vision narrowed until he was the only thing I could see. And when I reached him, I did. The only thing I could think of, the only thing that might work. I stepped into his space and wrapped my arms around him like I belonged there, like I had every right to be in his arms. I pressed my cheek against his chest as if I'd done it 100 times before. His body was solid, unmoving for a split second that felt like it might break me. Then his hand came up, resting lightly against my back, not pulling me closer, not pushing me away. Just there. Controlled. Deliberate. I whispered, barely loud enough for him to hear over the rain, "Please, just pretend you know me." My fingers tightened in the fabric of his jacket. I waited for him to step back. To question me. To expose me. But he didn't. And that scared me more than anything. Because men like him didn't play along with strangers, not without a reason. Behind me, I felt it, the moment Evan stopped walking, the moment he saw what I had just done, the moment everything changed. Because I hadn't just asked a stranger for help. I had stepped into something I didn't understand. Something I couldn't undo. And when the man I was holding finally moved, when his hand pressed just slightly firmer against my back, enough to make it look real, I realized I hadn't escaped anything at all. I had just chosen a different kind of danger. His hand did not tighten, but it did not leave either. And that was the first sign I had made a mistake I could not take back. Because men who helped you for a moment usually let go right after. But this man stayed exactly where he was, his palm steady against my back, like he had decided something without telling me. And I could feel it, that quiet decision, heavier than anything Evan had ever said out loud. The rain kept falling, sliding down my hair and along my neck. But under his coat, it was warmer. Not safe. Not comforting. Just contained. Like I had stepped into a space where everything was controlled, even the way he breathed, slow and measured against my cheek. And then I heard Evan's voice, closer now, sharper than before. "Claire, what are you doing?" My stomach dropped because he used my name like that, like he was reminding me who I belonged to. But the man I was holding did not move. Did not look surprised. Did not even glance down at me. He simply shifted his stance just enough that I was slightly behind him, like he had placed me there on purpose. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low. Calm. The kind of calm that made people listen without knowing why. You should leave, he said. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just certain. And for a second, nothing happened. The street noise continued. Cars passing. Rain tapping against metal. But then I felt Evan hesitate. Actually hesitate. And I had never felt that before. Never heard that gap in his confidence. She is coming with me, Evan said, trying again. But it sounded thinner now, like the words had lost weight the moment they left his mouth. The man in front of me exhaled slowly. Not annoyed. Not rushed. Just patient in a way that felt dangerous. No, he said. One word. Quiet. Final. And something shifted in the air. Not loud. Not visible. But real enough that even I stopped breathing for a second. Because it was not a conversation anymore. It was a line being drawn. And Evan saw it. I could tell by the silence that followed, by the way his footsteps did not move closer, by the way the rain seemed louder in that space between them. And then, unbelievably, Evan stepped back. Not far. Just enough to break whatever tension had been holding him there. This is not over, Claire, he said. But it sounded like something he needed to say more than something he believed. And then he was gone. Swallowed by the street and the rain like he had never been there at all. I realized my hands were still gripping the man's jacket, my fingers tight like I had forgotten how to let go. So I pulled back quickly, stepping out of his space. My heart was still racing. My thoughts trying to catch up with what had just happened. I am sorry, I said immediately. The words rushed out because silence felt worse. I just needed him to stop. I did not mean to involve you. I kept talking because he was not saying anything, and the quiet felt like it was watching me, measuring me. Thank you. I will just go, I added, already stepping back another inch, already trying to create distance, to turn this into something small and forgettable. But his gaze followed me. Sharp. Steady. And that was when I noticed it. Really noticed him for the first time. The clean lines of his suit. The way not a single thread looked out of place despite the storm. The way his eyes did not wander. Did not soften. Just stayed fixed on me like he was reading something written under my skin. Then his gaze dropped, just for a second, to my wrist, where my sleeve had shifted when I moved, exposing the faint discoloration I had tried so hard to hide. And when his eyes lifted back to mine, something had changed. Not softer. Not kinder. Just colder. More focused. How long? He asked. I blinked, confused. What? I said. But he did not repeat himself. Did not clarify. He just looked at my wrist again, then back at me. And I understood. The question was not about tonight. It was about everything before it. And I felt that familiar instinct rise up, the one that told me to minimize, to brush it off, to make it smaller so it would not matter. It is nothing. I said quickly, pulling my sleeve down. I just tripped earlier. But he did not look convinced. Did not look anything at all, really. Just calm. Observant. Like he was filing the answer away without accepting it. And then he said something that made my chest tighten again. You do not get to decide that, he said quietly. I frowned, a small spark of irritation cutting through my fear. Excuse me, I replied. But he stepped slightly closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough that I could not ignore him. You made it my business the moment you touched me, he said. The words were not loud. Not harsh. But they settled heavily in the space between us, like a truth I had not agreed to but could not deny. And for the first time since I ran out into the rain, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear exactly. Not relief either. Something more complicated. Because I had escaped Evan for now. But standing in front of this man, with his steady gaze and controlled voice, I realized I had not stepped out of danger. I had stepped into a different kind of it. One that did not chase you. One that simply waited for you to realize you were already inside. He did not raise his voice, and somehow that made everything feel louder, the rain, my heartbeat, the space between us, because men like Evan had always needed noise to prove control, but this man did not. He stood there like silence itself answered to him, and I realized I had no idea what to do next, because my plan had ended the moment Evan walked away, and now I was left standing in front of someone who did not look like he needed anything from me but was not letting me leave either. I said thank you, I repeated, softer this time, trying to reclaim something normal, something simple. I can handle the rest, I added, even though we both knew that was not entirely true, and for a moment he just watched me, not dismissing me, not agreeing, just observing like he was deciding whether I was worth correcting, and then his hand moved, not toward me, but slightly outward, a subtle signal, and the driver of the black SUV stepped out without a word, opening the rear door as if this had already been decided before I even understood the choice. You should go home, I said quickly, a small edge of frustration slipping through, because I did not like the way this felt, like I had stepped into someone else's plan without being asked, but he did not respond to that. Instead he glanced past me, toward the far end of the street, and I followed his gaze instinctively. Two figures stood under a flickering streetlight, not close, not approaching, just watching, and something cold slid down my spine, because they were not random, they were too still, too patient, and when I looked back at him, his expression had not changed, like he had expected them to be there. Those are not friends of yours, he said, not as a question, and I shook my head before I could stop myself. No, I admitted, my voice quieter now, and that was when he stepped closer, not aggressively, just enough that his presence blocked my view of the street again, like he was removing the option of pretending I had not seen what I saw. Then you are not walking away tonight, he said, and something in my chest tightened, not panic, not yet, but resistance, because I had spent too long trying to get my life back to let someone else decide it again. You do not get to decide that, I said, repeating his words back to him without meaning to, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, exactly, but interest, like I had done something he did not expect. And he tilted his head slightly, studying me in a way that made me feel seen and evaluated at the same time. No, he said after a beat, his voice still calm, but I do get to decide whether I let you walk into something you do not understand. And I almost laughed, a short, breathless sound that held no humor, because that was exactly what I had been doing all night, walking into things I did not understand. First Evan, now him. You do not even know me, I said, but he did not look convinced by that argument. I know enough, he replied, his gaze flicking once more to my wrist, then back to my eyes. And I know who he is, he added, and that stopped me, because the way he said it was different, not curious, not guessing, certain. Evan Brooks, he continued, saying the name like it meant something more than it should have. He does not follow people unless someone tells him to, and my breath caught, because that was not something I had considered, not something I wanted to consider. That is not true, I said quickly, shaking my head, but doubt crept in anyway, quiet and unwelcome, and he saw it. Of course he saw it, because nothing about his attention felt accidental. Believe what you want, he said, almost dismissively, but those men down the street are not here because of coincidence. And I turned again despite myself, the two figures still there, still watching, and suddenly the space around me felt smaller, tighter, like the city had shifted without warning. And when I looked back at him, something in me had already made the decision my pride was still arguing against. If I get in that car, I said slowly, choosing each word carefully. This does not mean anything. You helped me, that is it. I needed to say it out loud, needed to define the boundary before it disappeared completely, and for a second, he did not respond, just held my gaze with that same steady intensity, and then he said something that made the air feel heavier again. Nothing about this is nothing, he said quietly, and then he stepped aside just enough to gesture toward the open door of the SUV, not forcing, not rushing, just waiting, like he already knew what I was going to do, and that was the part that unsettled me the most, not the danger, not the unknown, but the certainty, The way he stood there like my choice had already been made long before I realized I had one, and as I took a step toward the car, the rain still falling, the street still watching, I understood something I should have known from the moment I touched him. I had not just asked for help, I had stepped into a story that was no longer mine to control. The door of the SUV stayed open like an invitation I did not trust, warm light spilling out against the rain-soaked pavement, and for a second I just stood there, staring at it, because stepping inside meant more than just getting out of the storm, it meant choosing him over whatever was waiting behind me, and I had spent too long trying to choose myself to hand that decision to someone else. But then I glanced back again, those two figures still under the streetlight, still watching, not moving closer, not leaving, just waiting, and that kind of waiting felt worse than chasing, because it meant they already knew where I would be, and my chest tightened as I exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible over the rain, before I stepped forward and slid into the back seat, the leather cool against my skin, the door closing behind me with a soft, final click that sounded louder than it should have, like something had just locked into place, not trapping me, not exactly, but sealing a choice I could not undo. The city outside blurred as the tinted window cut off the street, the noise dimming instantly, replaced by a quiet that felt intentional, controlled, like even the outside world had been filtered through him, and a second later he stepped in beside me, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with that same steady certainty that made everything feel prearranged. The driver closed his door and without a word, the car began to move, smooth and silent as it pulled away from the curb, and I felt it then, that strange shift, the one that comes when you realize you are no longer part of the street, no longer just another person trying to get home. I sat back, my hands resting in my lap, trying to keep them still, trying to ignore the way my pulse had not fully settled, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke. The silence stretching just long enough to feel deliberate, before I finally broke it. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt, because asking questions felt better than sitting inside them. He did not look at me immediately, his gaze fixed ahead as the city lights passed across his face in shifting patterns, highlighting sharp lines and shadows that made him look even more distant. "Somewhere you will not be followed," he said simply, and I frowned slightly, because that answer was not really an answer. "That could be anywhere," I replied, a hint of challenge slipping in before I could stop it, and this time he did glance at me, just briefly, but it was enough to make my breath catch, because there was nothing careless in that look, no distraction, no hesitation, just focus, like he was weighing my words the same way he weighed everything else. "Not for you," he said, and I did not know if that was meant as reassurance or a warning. The city continued to pass outside, familiar streets turning unfamiliar as we moved farther from where I thought I was going tonight, and I shifted slightly, aware of the space between us, aware of how close he was despite the distance. "You still have not told me your name," I said after a moment, because it felt strange, being in a car with someone who had already changed the course of my night without even introducing himself, and for a second he did not respond, like the question did not matter, and then he said it, quietly, "Luca," just that. No last name, no explanation, and somehow it felt like more than enough, like the rest of it carried weight I was not supposed to touch. "Claire," I said in return, even though he already knew, and that realization made something tighten in my chest again, because I still did not know how, and I was not sure I wanted to. The car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city fading further behind us, and I leaned my head back slightly, closing my eyes for a brief second, just long enough to gather my thoughts, but when I opened them again, I caught him looking at me, not in a way that felt intrusive, not like Evan had looked at me, but in a way that felt deliberate, like he was trying to understand something I had not said out loud, and I shifted under that gaze, instinctively pulling my sleeve down again, even though it was already covering everything. "You do not have to stay," I said, more to test him than anything else, because I needed to know if this was still a choice, and he did not answer right away, the silence stretching again, controlled, measured, before he finally spoke, his voice lower now, quieter. "You are already in my car," he said, and it was not a threat, not a command, just a statement, simple and undeniable, and as I looked out the window again, watching the last familiar street disappear behind us, I realized something that settled deep in my chest, heavier than fear, heavier than doubt. I had wanted someone strong enough to make Evan stop, and I had found him, but strength like that did not come without its own gravity, and now, whether I liked it or not, I was already being pulled into his world. The city lights thinned out the farther we drove, replaced by long stretches of quiet streets and tall gates that separated one world from another, and I realized I had stopped recognizing where we were at least 10 minutes ago, which should have made me more anxious than it did, but instead there was this strange calm settling over me, not because I trusted him, but because everything about him felt intentional, like nothing in this night had happened by accident, and I was too deep into it. Now to pretend otherwise, I shifted slightly in my seat, glancing at him again, trying to read something in his expression, anything that would make this feel more normal, but Luca did not offer anything easily. He sat beside me with the same controlled stillness, one hand resting against his knee, the other loosely clasped, his gaze occasionally flicking to the passing road but never lingering long, like he had already calculated everything ahead. "You said they were not random," I said finally, breaking the silence again because it was easier than sitting with my thoughts. "The men back there," and this time he did not delay. "They were not," he said simply, and I frowned, waiting for more, but he did not elaborate, and something in me pushed back. "That is not an answer," I said, my voice quieter but firmer now, because I needed something real, something I could hold on to, and he turned his head slightly toward me, studying me again in that measured way, like he was deciding how much truth I could handle. "You think your ex follows you because he cannot let go," he said, not unkindly, just stating it, and I swallowed, because that had always been the explanation I gave myself, the one that made everything make sense. "He does," I replied quickly, but the words felt thinner now. And Luca's gaze did not shift. "Men like him do not act without reason," he continued, "not when they are being watched," and something in my chest tightened again, that same cold thread of doubt pulling through me. "Watched by who?" I asked, my voice dropping without meaning to, and for a second he said nothing, then he looked forward again as the car slowed slightly, turning onto a long private drive lined with trees that blocked out the rest of the city. "By people who pay attention to patterns," he said, and that answer should not have made sense, but it did in a way I did not like, because it meant this was bigger than I had allowed myself to believe. The car continued forward until a set of tall iron gates came into view, already opening before we reached them, and I felt that shift again, that moment where the outside world fell away completely, replaced by something quieter, more controlled, more contained. We drove through without stopping, the gates closing behind us with a soft mechanical sound that echoed longer than it should have, and I watched it through the rear window, the last visible piece of the city disappearing as if it had never been there at all. "You still have not told me why you helped me," I said, turning back to him, because that question had been sitting in the back of my mind since the moment I stepped into his arms, and this time he did not avoid it. He met my gaze directly, holding it for a second longer than necessary. "You made a decision," he said, and I blinked, confused. I panicked, I corrected, but he shook his head slightly. "No," he said quietly, "you chose someone you believed could stop him," and the way he said it made something in my chest tighten again, because it was not wrong. I had chosen, even if it had been instinct, even if I had not understood what I was choosing. "And you were right," he added, just as the car came to a smooth stop in front of a large house that looked less like a home and more like something designed to keep everything outside from getting in, and for a second neither of us moved, the engine idling softly, the world holding its breath, and I realized that whatever happened next was not just about getting away from Evan anymore, it was about understanding what I had stepped into, and whether I could find a way out once I was fully inside it. For a moment, I did not move, because stepping out of the car felt like crossing another line I would not be able to erase, and I had already crossed too many tonight. The engine idling softly beneath us, the rain now lighter, almost distant, like it belonged to a different place entirely, and I realized I was stalling, holding on to the last few seconds where I could still pretend I was just passing through this, not becoming part of it. But Luca did not rush me, he did not reach for the door or speak, he simply waited, and somehow that patience felt heavier than pressure, because it meant he knew I would move eventually, and that certainty unsettled me more than anything else. So I reached for the handle myself and pushed the door open, stepping out onto smooth stone that glistened under soft exterior lights, the air cooler here, quieter, untouched by the chaos I had left behind, and when I looked up, the house in front of me rose with quiet authority, large but not loud, every line clean, every window lit just enough to suggest presence without revealing anything inside. It did not feel like a home, It felt like a place designed to hold secrets, and I wrapped my arms around myself without thinking, more out of instinct than cold, as Luca stepped out beside me, closing the distance between us again without effort. "This is where you bring all the strangers you pick up in the rain," I said, attempting something light, something normal, but the words sounded thin even to me, and he glanced at me briefly, not amused, not offended, just aware. "Only the ones who make decisions," he replied, and I exhaled slowly, because everything he said seemed to carry more meaning than it should, like there were layers I could not see yet. The front door opened before we reached it, and I paused for a fraction of a second, because that meant someone had been watching, waiting, anticipating our arrival, and the realization should have made me turn back, but there was nowhere to turn to anymore, so I stepped inside, the warmth immediate, wrapping around me as the door closed behind us with a soft, final sound, and the inside was just as controlled as the outside, clean lines, muted colors, everything in its place, nothing excessive, nothing accidental, and yet it felt lived in, like every object had been chosen for a reason I did not understand. A woman appeared from a hallway to the left, dressed simply but moving with quiet efficiency, her eyes flicking to me for a brief second before returning to Luca. "Waiting, not asking, guest room," he said, and she nodded once before turning without another word, and I blinked, thrown off by how easily that had been decided, like my presence here was already accounted for, like there had always been a place waiting. "I can call someone," I said quickly, turning toward him. "A ride, a friend, I do not need to stay." The words came out faster than I intended, because saying them felt like reclaiming something, but he did not interrupt, did not argue, he just watched me finish, and when I stopped, when the silence settled again, he spoke. "You can leave," he said, and for a second I felt a flicker of relief, but it did not last, because he continued, "But not tonight," and the relief faded just as quickly as it had come, replaced by that same complicated tension I could not quite name. "You keep deciding things for me," I said, softer now, less defiant, more tired, because the night was catching up to me, the adrenaline fading into something heavier, and he took a step closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to make sure I did not look away. "No," he said quietly, "I am deciding what happens around you," and that distinction should not have mattered, but it did, in a way that made my chest tighten again, because it meant he was not trying to control me, he was controlling everything else, and that might have been more dangerous. "Why?" I asked, the question finally breaking through everything else, because none of this made sense without an answer, and for a second he did not respond, his gaze steady, unreadable, and then he said something that settled deeper than anything else had. "Tonight, because someone already made you part of this," he said, "and until I know who, you do not walk out that door alone." And I stood there, in a house that was not mine, in a night that had changed direction without asking me, and I realized that whatever I thought this was, whatever I thought I had stepped into, it was already bigger than I had imagined, and I was no longer just trying to get away from the past. I was standing at the edge of something that was about to define what came next. I followed the woman down the hallway because standing still felt worse, like if I stopped moving I would start thinking too much, and thinking too much had never helped me before. The floor beneath my feet was quiet, soft in a way that absorbed sound, like even footsteps were not meant to echo here, and I realized that everything about this place was designed to keep things contained, voices, movement, maybe even people. The woman did not speak as she led me, just opened a door halfway down the hall and stepped aside, allowing me to enter first, and I hesitated for a fraction of a second before crossing the threshold, because I knew instinctively that once I stepped inside, this would become my space for the night, whether I accepted it or not. The room was simple but precise, a large bed, neutral tones, a window that overlooked darkness instead of the city, and a lamp already turned on like someone had prepared this in advance, not rushed, not improvised, prepared, and that realization made something in my chest tighten again. "If you need anything, there is a phone on the desk," the woman said quietly, her voice calm, professional, not curious, and I nodded, even though I was not sure what I would ask for, because I did not know what I was allowed to need here. She left without another word, the door closing softly behind her, and just like that I was alone, truly alone for the first time since the rain started, and the silence pressed in immediately, not uncomfortable, but heavy, like it was waiting for me to decide what to do with it. I walked further into the room slowly, My fingers brushing against the edge of the desk, the fabric of the curtains, small grounding movements to remind myself this was real, that I was not imagining any of this. I sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled, long and steady, my shoulders finally dropping as the tension I had been holding all night began to loosen, just a little, but the moment I closed my eyes, images flashed back, Evan's voice, the streetlight, the two figures watching, Luca's hand steady against my back, and I opened my eyes again quickly, because rest did not feel safe yet, not fully. I stood again, pacing. Once across the room, then back, my thoughts circling the same question over and over, why me, why tonight, why had this all aligned in a way that pulled me into something I did not understand, and then something small caught my attention, a folded set of clothes placed neatly on a chair near the bed, simple, comfortable, clearly not mine, and I stared at them for a second longer than necessary. Because it meant someone had anticipated I would stay, not hoped, not guessed, anticipated, and that made everything feel even more deliberate. I crossed the room slowly, touching the fabric, soft, dry, a contrast to the damp clothes clinging to my skin, and I hesitated again, because accepting them felt like accepting more than just warmth. It felt like accepting a role I had not agreed to, but the cold seeped deeper the longer I stood there. And eventually practicality won. I changed quickly, the quiet of the room wrapping around me as I moved, and when I sat back down on the bed, now warm, now dry, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest, not comfort exactly, but relief, small and cautious, like something inside me was allowing itself to breathe for the first time in hours, and that was when I heard it, a faint sound outside the door, not loud, not urgent, just presence, and I held still, listening. Because I knew instinctively it was not random, this place did not allow random, and after a second, I stood and moved toward the door, opening it just enough to see into the hallway, and there he was, Luca, standing a few feet away, speaking quietly to someone I could not see, his posture relaxed but alert, like even in stillness he was aware of everything around him, and he glanced toward me the moment the door opened, like he had already known I would be there, and for a second neither of us spoke. Just looked at each other across that small distance, and I realized something then that I had not fully understood before. I was not being kept here, not in the way I had feared, but I was also not free in the way I had been before, because freedom had never felt this structured, this watched, this intentional, and as I stood there and borrowed close, in a place that had prepared for me before I arrived, I understood that whatever role I had stepped into tonight, it was not temporary. It was the beginning of something that was already unfolding around me whether I chose to follow it or not. I should have gone back to the room, closed the door, and pretended this night had already ended, but I stayed in the hallway a second too long, long enough for the silence to settle and for my thoughts to catch up with everything he had said, and it did not feel like fear anymore, not the kind that made you run, it felt like awareness, like standing on the edge of something you could not yet see but knew was already moving beneath you. I crossed my arms lightly, more to steady myself than to guard anything, and looked at him again, really looked this time, the way he stood without shifting, the way the light caught along the edge of his collar, the way nothing about him seemed accidental, and I realized that whatever game he was talking about, he had already been playing it long before I stepped into it. You said we wait, I said quietly, and my voice sounded different to my own ears, less shaken, more certain, like something inside me had adjusted without asking permission. He did not answer right away, just watched me, and I wondered if he was measuring that change, if he noticed the difference as clearly as I did. Waiting is not passive, he said after a moment, his tone even, controlled, it is preparation, and the word lingered, heavier than it should have been, because I was not used to thinking like that, not used to being part of something that required strategy instead of reaction. I let out a slow breath and nodded once, not because I fully understood, but because I could feel the direction shifting, the same way I had felt it when I chose him in the rain, and I stepped back slightly, my hand resting against the doorframe again, grounding myself in something solid. Then tell me what you need from me, I said, and the question hung between us, simple on the surface but loaded underneath, because it meant I was no longer just trying to leave, I was asking how to stay without losing myself, and for the first time, his expression changed just enough to register, not softer, not warmer, but more focused, like the question mattered. I need you to do exactly what you have been doing, he said, and I frowned slightly. Which is, I asked, and he held my gaze, steady, unflinching. Be seen, he replied, and something in my chest tightened again, because that felt too easy, too simple for something that had already changed everything. That is it, I said. And he nodded once. That is enough, and the way he said it made me realize that in his world, visibility was not neutral, it was power, it was signal, it was leverage, and I stood there for a second longer, letting that settle, before finally stepping back into the room, closing the door slowly, the quiet returning like it had been waiting for me, and as I leaned lightly against it, staring into the stillness, one thought stayed with me, clearer than anything else that night. I had wanted to disappear, but now the only way forward was to be seen, and that might be the most dangerous part of all. I did not sleep, not really, because every time I closed my eyes I saw the same moment replaying in different ways, the rain, the street, the choice, his hand on my back, and the quiet certainty in his voice when he said I had already become part of something I did not understand, and sometime after midnight I gave up pretending, sitting on the edge of the bed with the room dim and still, listening to the silence like it might explain something if I stayed quiet long enough, but it did not. It only reminded me that everything outside these walls was still moving without me, and that thought pulled me to my feet again, slow, deliberate, as I crossed the room and opened the door just a few inches, the hallway empty this time, the light softer, calmer, like the tension from earlier had settled into something deeper, and I stepped out, barefoot now, the floor cool beneath my feet as I walked without a clear destination, just following instinct the same way I had earlier that night, and it led me to the same place, the end of the hallway where the light was slightly brighter, where the world felt less contained, and he was there again, exactly where I expected him to be, standing by a window, looking out into the darkness beyond the gates, not turning when he heard me, not needing to, because awareness seemed to follow him without effort. You do not sleep either, I said quietly, and this time there was no edge in my voice, just something softer, more honest, and after a second he responded, still facing the window, I do not when things are in motion, he said, and I stepped closer, not too close, just enough to stand beside him, looking out at the same darkness that revealed nothing. Am I one of those things? I asked, and the question felt different now, not defensive, not afraid, just real, and he turned slightly then, just enough that I could see the